Good morning. I'm Kurt Garfield, pastor of the Scipio Baptist Church, and I am so glad that God has given us our first new blessings of the day, and that blessing was to allow us to open our eyes one more time. I was just sitting here thinking about the other day when I was on the phone with a good dear friend of mine, Pastor John T. Berry, and I was sharing with him some of the things that I was struggling with. And, as I concluded my uh, long anecdote, and he pauses for a second only to reply, "You already know how to deal with it." And I waited on the phone as there was some sort of a pause, and I'm listening, and I'm like, what? And then later he says, "Go back and listen to your own devotions." And as I began to go back and listen to the devotions of the words that were spoken from my own lips, I began to be encouraged. Why? It's because I was encouraging myself. I was reminding myself on how good God is. And this also brings us to our devotion for this morning, coming out of Isaiah 43 and 26, where God speaks through Isaiah to his children. And he reads like this. He says, "Put me in remembrance. Let us reason together. Declare thou, that thou mayest be justified." God is saying to his children, he says, remind me of what I said. Now, if one was to read this and not understand its connection, we might be led off to believe that God is kind of absent-minded. But understand this. He's not asking us to remind him for him. He's asking us to remind him for us. In other words, in order to remind him of what he said, we first must know what he said. And by reminding him, guess what? I'm reminding me. Amen. So when the devil comes to you to remind you of who you used to be, just turn to God and remind him of who you are. See, I think that's a lot of times that, we spend so much time talking to the devil when we should be talking to God. So when the devil comes to you and says, "You this, you're that, you're this," just turn to God and remind God who you are. Remind him of what he says. And according to his word, remind him. Because, see, by us knowing God's word, we can remind God of his word. Just tell him, "God, you said." When the devil gets to talking crazy to you and get to putting thoughts in your mind, just turn to God and tell him, say, "God, you said, I am blessed and not cursed and cannot be cursed," according to Numbers 23 and 20. "God, you said, with long life, that you would satisfy me," according to Psalms 91 and 16. You can tell him, say, "God, you said, when my enemies come at me, you would defeat them and they will flee 7 different ways," according to Deuteronomy 28 and 7. You have to remind God what he said. And when we remind him what he said, guess what? That also reminds us of who we are. And we continue to tell him, favor is not for a season, but it's for a lifetime. So we have favor with God, according to Psalms 30 and 5. You would supply all of our needs. He said that according to his riches, which is in Philippians 4:19. All of these things is what God told us. I would live and not die, according to Psalms 118:7. You said, God, you said, you would be my vindicator. You would fight my battles. He said that. Now, all of these things we need to remind him of. And by us reminding him, we're reminding ourselves. So many of us, are dying spiritually. We're dying mentally, even physically. Not because of what God has said, but because we have listened to what the devil has said. We have listened to Satan so long, and we're buying what he's telling us, and we're running with it. Understand, Satan is the enemy of God. He's real, and he's the enemy of God. Well, it must be God's will for me to suffer and go. Let me tell you something. That's a lie from the pit of hell. That's not God's will for us to suffer, for us to be in lack, for us to be in want. That is not God's will. God's will for us is to be more than conquerors. That's God's will for us, is to be more than conquerors. And we read where he said, no weapon formed against us shall prosper. Remind him of that. Remind him, God, you told me this, that no weapon formed against me shall prosper. Remind him. And if the devil tell you, that these promises are not for you, if the devil tells us that, just turn to God. You ain't got to sit there and jaw jack with that fella. Just turn to God and remind him of Romans 2:11. Says, God, you said that you're not a respecter of person. So what you do for others, you'll do for me. You have to, according to your word, do it for me. So just remind him. He wants us to remind him of what he said. And when we remind him of what he said, we remind ourselves of who we are. And we're his children. He loves us and he cares for us. My name is Kurt Garfield, pastor of the Scipio Baptist Church. Every day you get up, remind God of what he says. And God bless you and God keep you. Until we meet again, you keep walking like a champ.